Welcome, everyone. My name is Jane Burke-Miller, and I am a Senior Mental Health Training and Implementation Associate at the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation at Boston University and the moderator for today's Making Sense of S.I.L.V.E.R Research webinar. S.I.L.V.E.R stands for Supporting Individuals to Live as Vibrant Elders in Recovery and is the name of the Rehabilitation Research and Training Center hosting this webinar, which is funded by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research, or NIDLR. The webinar content does not represent the views or policies of the funding agency, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government. The territory on which Boston University stands is that of the Wampanoag and Massachusetts people, and we honor and respect the history and current efforts of Native Indigenous communities. This webinar is being recorded so that you can access it later. Also, closed captioning has been turned on, and you can access this by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen. In case this is your first webinar with us, I'm going to introduce our speaker. They will share their research with you, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end. And actually, Michelle has some interactive activities today during the webinar. If you have a question during the presentation, please post your questions in the Q&A box, and I will pose them to Michelle at the end. If you have a technical question, please send a chat to me directly using the chat feature. Also, we would really appreciate your feedback about this webinar, so we'll be posting a survey at the end of the session. Now I'd like to welcome Dr. Michelle Zechner, who's going to present her work on Old Before Their Time, recent research on premature aging and declining physical functioning among middle-aged adults with serious mental health conditions. Michelle is an associate professor at Rutgers School of Health Professions in the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions, where she conducts research, teaches, and has special expertise in aging with mental health conditions. Her research focuses on multidimensional wellness interventions and interprofessional initiatives to improve health outcomes for people with mental health conditions. Dr. Zechner has worked in outpatient and inpatient mental health, nursing homes, and community aging services. She develops multi-platform educational content for various workforce development initiatives and is passionate about mental health recovery and aging well for all people. Dr. Zechner, welcome. We are really excited to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Jane. And as I'm so excited to be here, I was remembering, I think I actually visited the BU Center in 2013 or something like that. So it was awfully fun to kind of know physically where that is. I am having some weird issues with my audio. So if I start breaking up, I do hope that you'll let me know and I may have to jump off camera. But before I jump into my research today, I do want to say thank you to all of you and thank you for the invitation to talk about my research. I want to also acknowledge my collaborators on this particular project, Dr. Ellen Anderson, a physical therapist who's now retired from Rutgers, but has been very influential in my thinking and has been a partner in many ways, and also my chair, Dr. Ken Gill, who's been very influential in thinking about all this. So I want to start with a story. I know it's a story, but I think stories are important. I think all of us think stories are important. Why did this study come about? And the story is that we had a health promotion initiative that I was coordinating in 2013, about 11 years ago, that we were developing a pilot health promotion intervention called Wellness for Life. And during that, as the coordinator, I would often do the physical activities and the stretches and the baseline initiatives with everybody. So we would get on the floor, we would do sit-ups, we would do all these kinds of physical assessments. And I noticed that people could not get off the floor. And I was looking and I was like, how old are these folks? And they were like my age. And, you know, granted, we were all middle-aged, but they needed like two people to help them get up off the floor. And I kept thinking, you know what? This is wrong. This is wrong. There's something wrong here. We're not thinking about this. So that was kind of like why this study began. Was I really started to become curious about why people were having so many problems with their physical functioning. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. We're going to talk about what we found in our study. We're going to talk about some practical implications and clinical strategies. Well, practical implications, program strategies, and policy suggestions. And then I'm going to ask you to apply some of the information that we talked about, because I'm curious to think how it might impact your setting and what you do, or how you do things you do. So I've set this up, so I am a clinical intervention researcher, but I wanted to make sure that this really had accessibility to everybody. I don't know if everybody can see what's on my screen, but the rationale, or why was this study important? We know that people living with mental health conditions have health problems, and that's been documented, gosh, since 2000. And you all at Boston have a wonderful pioneer in this, Dr. Dory Hutchinson, who I'm just such a fan of, talking about the health problems that people have experienced. And there's a lot of documentation that things like cancer, breathing problems, heart issues, and even I'm working on a study now to look at oral health and dental health, and that's really, really a big problem as well. We also know that people have a hard time accessing care, whether it's insurance, whether it's transportation, whether it's stigma and discrimination. It's not always easy for folks to get the kind of health care that they need. We also know that people are not walking as much as the general population. I did my dissertation looking at motivating physical activity in people with mental health conditions, and I found, and like many other studies, that people are walking less. They're not moving as much, and there's a lot of reasons for that, but it contributes to health problems down the road, like heart problems. And all of this combined to have a risk for a shorter lifespan, which I think everyone is aware of at this point. So this is sort of the background, and then put it into this context of seeing people struggling who were in their 40s in a way that looked a lot older to me. And I, because I've worked in nursing homes, I've worked in different settings, I was like, these folks really are moving in a way that looks a lot older. So I sort of kept throwing around this idea. And the question I came to in my research was, do people living with mental health conditions function at levels older than their chronological age? And of course, you all are experts in aging. We know that chronological age is like our number, what number are you, 50, 55, 60, 70? And then there's functional aging, which is, are you moving in a way that's the same number as your chronological age, or are you moving at a number that's higher? And my theory, my hypothesis, based on my experiences and engaging with folks, was that people were moving at ages older than their chronological age. So please feel free to drop any questions or comments in the chat. I welcome that. So what did we do? The methodology. I mentioned that this program called Wellness for Life. So we collected some data and refined our protocol, which was it was a kind of cool program. It was a three-pronged approach to health promotion. It had peer wellness coaches, it had interprofessional kind of didactic information from nutritionists, dentists, physical therapists, and people in psych rehab and peers. And then we did physical activity together, 30 minutes. We did it once a week for 8 weeks, and we found that people actually improved their physical functioning. So their ability to move actually got better. And the way we measured it, I'll talk about that in a second, but we measured that very, very specifically in terms of strength, and using our muscles, flexibility or stretching, and endurance, which is like how far can you go. So we measured it in different ways. The exciting thing is we saw some changes, significant changes in all of our functional measures after 8 weeks, which was pretty cool. We didn't, people didn't lose weight, which was kind of expected. We didn't expect that would necessarily be the case, but the idea that you could in 8 weeks do 30 minutes of exercise once a week and have some changes. I mean, I think also because of the peer wellness coaching, a lot of folks were making other lifestyle changes. So that's just a little bit in a nutshell what Wellness for Life was about. And I put the citation in if anyone wants to look at that study. But that was pretty cool. And then, this question kept buzzing around, what were people like at baseline? So we thought, well, we have this data we collected on 67 people over 2 years that were involved in the program, and they were all interested in being, more fit or thinking about their health and wellness. But so we used the baseline data, the data when we first met them from 67 people, and our average age was 50, right? Which there's a lot of discussion. We could probably all have a healthy, rigorous discussion about what is older adulthood for people living with mental health conditions. I've talked about it, thought about it for several years, probably more than I ever should. But based on the literature, many people are saying that older adulthood really begins for people living with mental health conditions at about 50 or 55. Some folks have even reported 40, which I'm a little shocked and stunned by, but I think the general agreement in most studies is it's about 50 years old. So our cohort was 50, an average of 50 years old, and our standard deviation was 11 years. So we had some younger people, we had some older people. So we had, I think the oldest person who participated was 70 in that study. So we looked at that group and we said, because we had my amazing colleague, Dr. Zambo Anderson, a physical therapist, who it's just amazing. It's really, I think everyone should have a collaborator who's a physical therapist. They're so wonderful. And so they think in such a different way. And in rehab, we have similar goals. We want folks to get better and move on with their lives, but they think very differently and their approaches are very different. So Dr. Anderson said, you know what, let's look at, because she's a specialist in gerontological physical therapy. And she said, there are these standardized measures of strength and fitness for people who are 65 and older. So I was like, oh, really? And so we compared our cohort to these standards. We looked at 3 measures. So we did some additional testing that isn't reflected here, but these are the things that we could actually find what they call standardized values for. And that's the sit to stand test, which is literally, it's a really easy way to measure strength. You ask someone to sit in a chair and not use their hands and stand up and sit down repeatedly. I believe it's 30 seconds or a minute, and the number of times indicates the measure of strength and physical functioning. So that was one. The 6-minute walk test, it's really pretty simple. It's how far can you walk in 6 minutes? How many steps do you take? And we had physical therapists and physical therapy students helping us with people measuring that. And the other one is called the single-legged stance. And that's literally you're standing on one foot. And how long can you stand on one foot? I believe it's also 30 seconds. So those are how we defined physical functioning. It's different in different, it's defined differently in different programs, different thinking, but that's how we defined it. Physical functioning were sort of these basic elements of physical performance. So what did we find? If I did find a picture of what the single-legged stance looks like. And sometimes, after I did this study, I would sometimes, while I was shopping with the shopping cart, I would stand on one foot and practice the single-legged stance to improve my balance, because it's an easy thing you can do, even at the grocery store. But what did we find? What we found was pretty shocking. It was kind of worse than what I thought. So in the sit to stand, that our population, our cohort of folks who were in our project, they performed worse on average than 80 to 89-year-old adults in the general population. So if our average age of our folks, was 50, if you were 50, you were sort of performing functionally at a level of 80 to 89-year-olds, which is pretty shocking. And if you think about it, we probably have a lot of folks that we engage with who are in their 40s, or 30s. They may be already experiencing some of this impact, depending on the length of time. It's very complicated. Things like the impact of medications over time, the impact of poverty, the impact of health problems. So it's dependent on a lot of different factors that I can't really address, because this was sort of a retrospective analysis. We looked back in time. we looked at the 6-minute walk test. It was worse in our population than most 80 to 89-year-olds. Again, these are strength measures. And I'm just looking at the chat now. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Lee, that now we've got folks that are living over the ages of 60. That's something that a very important point. Previously, people were dying much earlier. Yeah. So I think that's a wonderful point that we do need to consider that. Also, the medications have changed over time, right? We've had sort of the classical first generation antipsychotic medications, and we got the second generation. Now we're kind of in the third generation range. I see a question. Did these difficulties have much to do with comorbid conditions? Yeah, I think that's a huge limitation to our study, is that we didn't exclude anyone. And the important thing that you need to know is that a lot of the previous research on physical functioning and exercise, a lot of researchers say, you know what, if you've had a heart condition, if you have diabetes, if you have these other health conditions, we don't want you in our study. In our study, my philosophy and that of Dr. Gill, who was the PI, is we wanted a real world sample. We wanted to know. These were folks who were receiving services in outpatient community services, or in New Jersey, we call it partial care. And I know that the terms are different by state, but these were folks who were receiving services. Did they? Yes, they absolutely had comorbid conditions. And it's been a while. I have the article. I think off the top of my head, we had about a third, is what I recall, of folks who had diabetes, but there were a lot of health conditions, lung problems. I know one gentleman had just had a heart situation, had a heart attack, and we had our PT there, and our PTs were assessing for safety, which you have to do before, and we adapted each cohort. We had 5 cohorts, and each cohort we really had to adapt the physical program because people were in really different shapes. The younger folks had much more energy, much more physically able, hadn't been on medications as long. And then we had folks who'd been in the system, who'd been taking medications a really long time, had multiple health conditions, and they were really, really impaired. And a lot of Parkinsonianism, some stiffness and difficulty. Some folks had really significant tremors and things like that. So I appreciate those questions. Yeah, so the single leg stance, I was a little bit surprised that was sort of the best, because folks were kind of at the range of 60 to 69-year-olds, and that's about balance, right? And I really had thought that a lot of the medications that, and we have the data. I want to do a follow-up study on what was the role of medication, self-report medications on physical functioning, because what we noticed is a lot of people reported like 3 to 4 to 5. I think the range was like 3 to 7 psychotropic medications, and I would have expected that people's balance would have been worse, but it was not. It was not as bad as I expected. So at any rate, so let's talk about the practical implications for a moment. I think you all probably know, I'm going to ask you to think about this in the people that you know and in the settings that you're in, what this might have, what kind of implications this might have for your settings. But we know that people are experiencing challenges with physical activity and movement. So people aren't walking as much or moving as much, and that's partly because they have more problems with it. They have more problems with walking and moving. There's also some concern, and we need to be thinking about difficulty with activities of daily living and instrumental activity of daily living. That question really hits me. I am a family member of an older adult who has a mental health condition, and I see this every day in my family, in my life, and I see it in the folks that I've supported in the past, is things like going up steps. like being able to, the housing stock in New Jersey is very old. I imagine in Massachusetts it's very similar. There are a lot of steps, a lot of like retrofitted kind of funky apartment and housing situations and high costs of living. So the housing has been really, really a problem for people to navigate get the help they need and being able to navigate that. Even things like carrying the laundry basket up and down the steps, being able to reach up on the top shelf to put away your groceries or carry your groceries from the bus stop to your house or from your car to the house or bus, however people are getting transportation. So it has a lot of impact in these areas. I think we have to be thinking about independent living. A lot of we want people to be as independent as possible in their communities, in the housing of their choice, and think about that. What's interesting is there's not a lot of research. I may be wrong. I teach a class on aging and psychiatric rehabilitation, and I make my students do lit searches every time I teach the class. I keep asking them, look for papers on housing for older adults living with mental health conditions. They haven't, so far we found one that was written, I think in 1990. It was interesting though, because that study found that a lot of older, the participants in that particular study really preferred not to live in scattered site sort of settings. They would rather, or living all over the place, they wanted roommates. Or not roommates, they wanted to be sort of like in a centralized setting with someone, companionship and access to people and talking to people. So I think we need to understand, given the limitations and challenges that people have physically, how that impacts their housing and what that means for them to be able to be as independent as possible. And then that leads into housing accessibility. I've talked to some supported housing providers here, and many of them are struggling with people are aging in those services, and how do we how do we make sure those settings have services? If it's a long-term setting, it's a place that person's living, how can they stay there as long as they can? And then there's all these kind of complicated, we'll talk about the policy components in a second, but there's all these complications, like if someone wants hospice services or if they need nursing home level services, can they stay in their supported housing where people know them and they're sort of part of that community if they choose to, or if they want to live independently outside of any of these kinds of structured systems, how can they get the care that they need? And then we'll talk about that a little bit, but there's a lot of discrimination and stigma in aging services, because I do a lot of work in aging services. Aging services are terrified of working with people with mental health conditions. And so they don't always get the resources that are available because of this sort of, like, it's almost like NIMBY, but I don't know what it would be called. It would be like NIMBY for aging services. Like, we can't offer services in a way that meets folks' needs. I don't know. I'm just, sort of thinking about this from an advocacy perspective. I can't help myself. And then really, the bottom line is, how does physical functioning impact someone's ability to achieve their goals, the things that meaningful life, purpose in working, education, and social arenas? Like, how does this impact someone's ability to make friends, to connect to a faith community, to engage in the community? If you're not able to walk very far, or you're uncomfortable standing, that could really limit like your choices and your options in terms of what's available. Okay. Oh, I see another interesting comment. Lee, you are just on top of it. Lee is pretty amazing. And folks who are have Social Security income limited and they can't afford groceries, and people delivered to medications delivered. Yes, very nice. Yeah, that sounds like a really, really nice setting. So Lee is offering some suggestions on a local service in Brookline, which is wonderful. Thank you. And we need to look at these models and replicate them and think about how can we do a little more integration, which is, I think, a really important recommendation as well. So some program recommendations. I'm thinking that some of you are involved in either volunteer programs or providing care for others. I think that in mental health, in peer services, we need to be thinking about what PT has been talking about for a long time, which is individualized exercise prescriptions, which is looking at where is a person at. And the National Institute on Aging has a really, really wonderful free program. I think it's called Move and the number 4 life, Move for Life. And they have a great, like, how to safely start as an older adult moving, and how to even measure yourself with the sit to stand with the 6-minute walk test. One thing I do want to mention is we need to be thinking about these issues at a much younger age in mental health services than we ever did. So we think, I thought, I mean, I worked, as I said, in aging services, and we always defined older adults, 65 and older, 60 and older. Now AARP is sort of like 50 and over. But we need to kind of translate our thinking and say that, as the Gerontological Society of America, they sort of say we're aging every day. And we need to be talking about aging issues at a much earlier age, in the services that we provide to sort of help people and navigate the skills and resources they may need. Also thinking about weekly walking, Tai Chi, yoga, and dance programs. I was so fortunate to be involved in a program evaluation of some folks who looked at using Tai Chi, a modification of Tai Chi in a state psychiatric hospital in the geriatric units. And I was just stunned. I would attend those groups, and folks really loved them. I mean, it was really powerful that everyone was able to engage regardless of sort of where they were at cognitively, what was going on for them that day. I think that's a powerful intervention that needs to be looked at more. Anything to get people moving. We should also be looking, as I said, at younger adults, and also thinking about it as prevention for functional challenges later. I sort of tease my family member and I'm like, we have to take a walk a day. That's our prescription. Like, we go for walks like sometimes twice a day. And in this heat, we've been going, early in the morning, late at night. But I know that that's the key to keeping both of us healthy and well, and have positive aging and healthy aging. We need to look at the ADL and IADL strengths and deficits in our programs. So we need to sort of make sure that we're attending to those issues in a meaningful way, and using personal recovery goals to inform functional needs. So I always used to, I've done a lot of wellness presentations, and I always joke, my personal goal is I have 3 cats. They're all 10 pounds. When I take them to the vet, I need to be able to lift 30 pounds and go up and down 5 steps, because that's how many there are in my house. So we need to know what's important to the person and why they should be thinking about these things, and how it connects to other things like positive aging and good brain health as we get older for everyone. Movement is really, really critical to good health. Some of the policy implications we have to be thinking, and I think you all are probably on the forefront of this, I'm guessing, of how we can integrate aging, mental health, and community health services. There's some overlap. There's some wonderful, initiatives. I've seen there's some different programs across the country that are doing really interesting work. California, Illinois, Oregon. I'm sure you all are doing some great stuff in Massachusetts. I would love to say that we're doing great stuff in New Jersey, but I think we're still learning. It's hard. It's hard policy work. Also expanded housing services and options. So looking at the types of things that people want, and offering the supports that they need. We also need to be looking at additional supportive services for independent living, making sure that people can live where they want to live safely. And as you know, in gerontology, we often think about safety versus independence. And I think that those conversations, those end of life conversations, those safety conversations need to happen like, a little bit earlier than in the general population. We should really be thinking about reimbursement for physical activity and mental health services. I think walking is so powerful. There's so much evidence that it changes your brain, it changes your body, improves your health. We really need to find ways to incorporate safe. And I don't say exercise because I think a lot of people hear exercise and they're like, I'm not going to the gym, and I've had people give me the list, like, I don't have tennis shoes, I don't have socks, like, I can't even do this. And, sort of making it accessible for people in a way, like maybe you all heard this study too. I participated in a study with from Columbia in New York City, and it was literally like break up your sedentary behavior, stand up and walk or move, do something for 5 minutes for every hour that you're sitting. And I tried it. I felt amazing. I was like, wow. And they found a lot of changes in focus and concentration and mood in that study. And there were like thousands of people who participated. So we need to be, I think, in mental health, thinking a little, in psych rehab, thinking how can we use some of these ideas in our own field and also paying people for them. And then collaboration with physical therapists, exercise physiologists or kinesiologists, occupational therapists, and other allied health professionals. Our colleagues have a lot of interesting perspectives, and they know about rehabilitation in a different way than we know, and they can really support us in the work that we do and promote healthy aging and good functional mobility in folks. So I've been talking a while, and I'm just seeing, okay. And thank you, Lee brought up the important role that older adult peer specialists come into play. That is really, really important. I've had some wonderful collaborations and discussions with peer supports in New York City. And they're just amazing, really amazing. We need to do more of that. And I think that peer supports have a role in functional mobility as well, to be talking about like how important it is to get up and move, and how we can, by moving just a little bit each day, we're actually helping ourselves with positive aging. There's a great, I'm going off track for a moment, but I was involved in a project with the Academy of Peer Services, which is funded through NIAPRS and Rutgers. But they have a new certificate program for older adults, and it's a 5-course kind of seminar on older adults. And I was part of this amazing team with like these amazing peers, specialists who created that content, and it's free for anybody. You do have to kind of give them your email and register. If you're in New York State, you get a certificate. If you're not, you get free education basically on a topic that very few folks are actually talking about this topic. So Lee, you're all, as always, you are ahead of the game, an advocate. So now I'd like to stop my talking, and I would love to get to the questions that you have, and or we can. I'd like for you. I don't know. What do you think, Jane? Should we do questions first, or should we do the activity first?
Oh, sorry. There's only a couple questions. Let's look at those,
Okay.
if that's all right.
Yeah.
And really, it was just because I think you addressed them as we were going along. One interesting question was how do we know if we are moving at our chronological age? Um, and I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, as soon as we're off, I'm going to try the sitting and standing test and see how many times I can do it in 30 seconds. But I don't know if you could speak to that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So there are standardized norms. They're called standardized norms for, and it was kind of mind-boggling. Ellen Anderson, my colleague, really had to help me figure this out. But there are norms based on gender, right? And there's norms based on decade of life and different measures. So it's kind of like, probably the easiest way to do it would be look up sit to stand normed values by age, and then you can get the average. Of course, you understand, it's important to know that averages are great, but it's sort of like, that means that you've got the super high performing folks, the super low performing points folks, and then they're like, we kind of average it together and it's kind of in the middle. So then you could see if you're performing at that level. There are better measures that are listed for geriatrics, because there's a lot of concern about functional ability, because functional ability is linked to falls and premature institutionalization in older adults. So there's a lot of thinking and concern about that. There aren't such great comprehensive information on other generations. So that would be my suggestion.
That's interesting. And Lee was just pointing out, in addition to the New York State and Academy of Peer Services training, UPenn has a certification training for older adult peer specialists as well. So,
Thank you, Lee.
let's see. Someone's just sharing the difficulty since having cancer of getting out of a chair, even though generally in good shape.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that, and I think that I know for me too, like when you don't feel well, it's really hard to get moving. And what I think is really helpful for us to consider is that a lot of us, and I know myself included, I'm like, I never go to the gym, but it's important to sort of say, oh, wow, you know what? I stood up. I'm mindfully, intentionally standing up 5 times in a day for, and you need to work yourself up. Like, I don't know if any of you have had this experience. I go to the gym, the trainer works me out. I'm so sore, I can't move for a week. And then I'm like, this is not helping. And that's one approach, right? But another approach, which would be build yourself up. Like that's actually more motivational. Start with what you can do and then increase it in tiny increments. The booklet I was talking to you all about, the National Institute on Aging's Move, or I think it's called Move for Life or Fit for Life. I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of it. But if you Google that, you'll find it. And it's really, really helpful, like how to get started. Don't overdo it. Stay safe. Talk to your doctor before you get started. Think about like touching on the different areas. So there are 3 areas in functioning, physical functioning and movement that you want to consider. And that's, do you stretch? Are you using your muscles? And are you sort of getting your heart rate up a little bit safely? But you need to do that under the care of a doctor. If you have had cancer or other heart conditions or other health conditions, you definitely want to talk to your provider before you start anything. But I think the really important thing is that everyone can do something. And I really shifted my mindset for myself personally, and the way I think about it with my family is, I don't think about it as I'm exercising. I think about this as there's so much evidence that when you exercise, when you walk, when you move, you're building new synapses, you're building new connections in your brain. There's some fascinating research coming out of the University of Pittsburgh that looks at, for folks who have the Alzheimer's gene, I think it's, one of the Alzheimer's genes, they tested folks who walked, I think 30 minutes 3 times a week. I mean, it was a modest, quote unquote, modest amount. But they found that they could stay cognitively more healthy and well for a longer amount of time than folks who walked less. So I'm convinced by the research that physical activity is really important for brain health, and it's really in cognition and thinking, but it's also really, really important for mental health. It's really a lot of evidence that walking supports reducing anxiety and depression. There's some evidence that suggests that weightlifting can support and reduce anxiety. These mind-body initiatives, yoga, tai chi, Pilates, like anything where you're sort of moving and breathing, those can also have been identified to reduce perception of stress and depression. So there's just an abundance of evidence that suggests that we should be thinking about movement and functional ability, not as like go to the gym kind of thing, but as a lifestyle, as a way to, enjoy life a little bit more, to have a better mood, to have our brains work better. I mean, I always sort of laugh at myself a little bit, but I mean, my job is thinking. And I don't know if anyone had COVID. I had COVID. Oh man, for 3 months, my brain was just not working. And I was like, okay, I know I need to continue walking because I knew that was going to help my brain heal a little bit. So that was my own personal opinion. That there's no research behind that. I want to say a disclaimer.
There's just one more question, and then we can do your activity.
Yeah.
It was just, does the presidential fitness test apply here? I think that's something we had to do in school. seem to remember. I think that's more, it's probably a little more vigorous than the measures, the other measures, the sit stand and the one leg stand and the,
Right. Yeah, I think the presidential fitness test, you're right, I don't know the specifics on it, but I think it's for younger generations. The measures that we looked at, the sit to stand, the 6-minute walk test, and another one that we started doing later on, but we didn't have enough data really to include was the hand test, hand strength test, because there's a really strong correlation in hand strength and health. And so those are standardized for older adults, and we really wanted to look at it from what's already being used in older adults. I'm trying to think of any others. There's something called a reach test, where you sit in an edge of a chair and you reach forward, and it's again another kind of a balance test. We did do that for a couple of cohorts, but we couldn't standardize it. We did another measure where we asked people to jump up, which was, that only lasted one cohort. Cohort, I was like, I didn't feel safe, like
yeah.
jumping up, But yeah, so those are the typical kinds of measures. And again, if you look at that National Institute on Aging, is it Fit for Life or Move for Life? Sorry, I just can't recall. They actually have the measures listed and how to do them safely for yourself. Again, always talk to a health provider, or recommend that someone talk to a health provider before they get started, particularly if they've had a lot of health conditions. But I think there's just a lot of evidence that people with a lot of health conditions can move. And it isn't that they're running 5 miles, it's that they're starting out by standing up a few times a day, and maybe they go for a 2-minute walk. We need to sort of look at in from a rehab perspective, like how do we sort of one step at a time to build people's endurance and abilities. All right. Well, oh, thank you, Jane. I'm not able to multitask that way.
It's Get Fit for Life, Exercise and Physical Activity for Healthy Aging.
Thank you.
That's linked to the guide, so, yeah.
Thank you so much.
It's a great resource.
It's it's a great resource we talked about using that maybe in with peer supporters and self-help, like how can people use these tools for themselves. So let me ask you, I want to hear from you. I've been talking a lot. How does physical functioning impact the people in your life? If you could drop that in chat, like what do you notice? What kinds of problems or challenges or adaptations even have you seen of folks who are aging and may have some physical mobility challenges? I will say, some of the adaptations that I've used in my house is I put additional railings in, put a tub rail in, also sort of like prompting my family member to, sometimes my family member tends to kind of get up really fast, and then there's kind of a moment and I'm like, oh dear. And I'm like, let's just take our time. I try to be a support and be like, we're not rushing here. There's no rush. We don't need to move too fast. Anything else that people have seen?
Just when you mentioned the hand strength test, I was thinking about it's so important to be able to live independently that you can open things and lift things, which is definitely a challenge for many people as they get older. Having to make sure that you have food delivered, but you can't open it, or you have medications delivered, but you can't open the medications because they're childproof. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's a really great point. And someone has just dropped in that sometimes people don't have a lot of stamina when trying a new physically demanding activity, and they give up that activity. Yeah, that's a really great point. So I'm just thinking about something like bowling. Maybe someone loves bowling, and bowling is actually pretty physical, right? You got to lift this heavy ball. You got to have some manual dexterity to sort of hold the ball. You have to walk with the ball and not, kind of lean to the side. And I mean that, that can be very discouraging. And then thinking about how can we break that, as a psych rehab person, I'm always like, how would we break that into small steps? How would we help people start to build their balance and their upper body strength some so that they could build it up gradually and then practice with, some weights and things until they could actually do the bowling. Okay. I think it's all kinds of complications. And the interesting thing also is that a lot of the people that I've talked to do walk a lot. They take public transportation. They may not have a car. They do walk a fair bit, but they may walk very slowly. They may not be able to walk as far as they used to, things like that. So it's important to think about how that impacts the person, their particular unique situation. Do they have dogs or cats? Do they have great nieces or children or grandchildren that they want to pick up and play with? I mean, one person that in the Wellness for Life program, their real intention was they wanted to get on the floor and play with their niece and nephew, and they were having a hard time getting on the floor and then being able to stand up again. So knowing what that kind of impacts the person, and then thinking about, I'm curious now, how have you adapted any of your services to address the physical functioning of your clients? Like, have you done something? Have you installed a ramp? Like, what are some things that you've done? Oh, okay. Wow. And so somebody's pointing out a special kind of bowling. I did not know that. Thank you again. Had no idea. As not being a Northeasterner, I didn't know. Folks don't always qualify for some physical health classes. Absolutely. Again, this idea of exclusionary criteria, and I think this is an advocacy issue that we need to be thinking about in mental health, is that everyone needs to move a little bit more, and we shouldn't be excluding folks who need it the most, right? Because a lot of the medications that people are taking have an impact on, things like tardive dyskinesia, right? Or involuntary movements are a side effect, or Parkinsonianism, which is sort of the trembles that people get from some of the medications. Those really impact all kinds of things, preparing food, coffee. Oh my gosh, what a big thing. Coffee, pouring milk into coffee. It's such a drama in my house. It's really hard and frustrating. Brushing your teeth. And wonderful. I see yoga is starting. How people feel versus how they can perform and how tight they are, because some of the medications also, I didn't know this, maybe you all knew this, but certain medications tighten the muscles, and then there's sort of like a tightening, not just in the face, which is pretty common, but it can also be in the body, in the back, and the arms and the legs, which makes it harder to bend over, tie your shoes, if you drop something on the floor, how do you pick it up, things like that. Definitely and pin bowling. And Medicaid doesn't pay for health club memberships. That's a great point. That's definitely needed. And in vocational training, needing to adjust hours and duties because our folks are deconditioned. Absolutely. Maybe they're so tired that they can't stand if they need to stand on the line, or if they get, what I see also is people get really tired and just doing the work, particularly for folks who may have been, sort of in recovery from a mental health condition or a recent change in medications, they're not able to focus for 8 hours. They need a break, and that's, not necessarily physical functioning, but it's part of it in vocational. Yes, and chair yoga, definitely very, very helpful. And Wii bowling, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, Wii is a great way for folks to have fun and sort of get involved in that way. So last question I'd like to ask you to consider, how might you use some of what we've talked about today in your setting or in your life or in general? How might you use what we've talked about? Oh, and someone else is talking about the impact of functional ability and stamina on presidential voting. That makes sense because people have to stand in line. I mean, my voting site is, I'm lucky, it's 2 blocks from my house, but I wouldn't drive, but I'd have to walk, but then walking is, could be a problem. Sneaking in more movement into passive activities. Yes, AKA, Lauren, I would say have fun, right? Have fun. Because when we talk about when we talk about exercise, people shut down. They're like, thank you, no, goodbye. But when we talk about what's your favorite dance move, or we do some of the mind body stuff, people really seem to be much more engaged and interested in that. I'm more engaged and interested in that. And I met these, I presented at a International Physical Therapy Association. So internationally, physical therapists are very involved in mental health, right? Not so much in the US, but in Europe, it's a thing. And I met this amazing person who was talking about tailoring physical activities to a person's mood. And I'll just give you a quick example. Like for people who are have more depressed or have more depressive symptoms, having more energizing activities, kind of waking up and shaking and rubbing your hands and sort of things to kind of activate the body a little bit. And then alternately, she was talking about for things, for people who were more kind of excited or agitated or irritated or upset or maybe a little manic, calming activities, things like breathing and moving and slower kind of yoga, things to calm things down. Yes. Oh, Andrian, you hit the nail on the head. Physical functioning in our initial assessment of clients. Absolutely. I think physical functioning should be, and there's one called the WHODAS, the World Health Organization Disability Assessment, something. But there are functional assessments that you can use, but we should be talking to people about pain. I mean, my colleague was always like, do we talk to people about pain? Because people often have, I have foot pain, people have knee pain. We don't necessarily in mental health ask people, are you in pain today? Are you working with a doctor for pain? It makes sense that people would have more pain, and we should know also what, where they're at and where they might want to go, because their physical functioning may get in the way of, as you were mentioning, getting a job, getting a date, living independently. And oh, hey, before you do bingo, let's do a couple of quick stretches. Absolutely. Or do maybe a bingo. I don't know how you would do like a movement bingo, like maybe it would be on the card or something. I don't know how that would work, but I'm sure there's something out there. I think that's brilliant. And I know for any of us who it is a thing, oh, cool, I'll have to check that out. Back in the day, a million years ago, my very first job was in a nursing home. And it was a nursing home that had a lot of folks who had been deinstitutionalized. And those folks were in their 60s and 70s and been in state hospitals in Illinois for decades. It really sparked me on this path, right? Because I kept thinking, wow, physically people have a lot of challenges, and how can we help people not end up in nursing homes? How can we help them stay as independent as possible? And there are all those fun activities, in other nursing home settings I've seen, they do this thing with the balloon where you throw the balloon around, and then the parachute thing, so there are some things, but absolutely. And I really also like to talk to people a lot about the value of movement for brain health as well as physical health, so that it becomes kind of like this is a both and. Like you're not only helping your body, you're helping your brain stay young, right? So the more we can have these conversations in a fun way, in a light way, not as another like sort of finger pointy. I remember, you learn things in your career, and one thing that I learned, I went to a community wellness center and I was talking about physical health, and somebody just put their head down on the table and they cried, and they were like, people are always telling me that I'm overweight, that I have to do these things, and I don't know what to do. I feel so overwhelmed. And I was like, you're absolutely right. This is the wrongest way to start this. I mean, I said that wrong, but this is the worst way to start this. So we really have to also consider a person's readiness, as we sometimes call that, how ready are they, how motivated, how interested, and then really how does that connect to what they love to do? Like, I know, I don't know if any of you know Peggy Swarbrick, but she's one of my mentors. She used to love to swim, and she would swim a lot. I hate swimming. I don't want my head in the water. No, that's not something for me. I love yoga, and I know people who are like, they will not do yoga. They don't like yoga. So it's really important to sort of find the thing that makes sense, but also maybe make it like applied in someone's life. So, cleaning house, I used to have a calorie thing on how many calories you burn when you scrub a floor on your hands and knees and vacuum and wipe the walls and dust and things like that. We have to think more and more, I believe, about movement as a harm reduction. We need to be thinking not as if you sort of change your entire abilities. You basically start a little bit at a time and move.
We're getting near the end of our hour here, so I just want to note a couple more comments. One about some local hospitals in the Boston area asking about pain as a fifth vital sign. That's really interesting. And then at an apartment, the management provides residents with plant boxes that they can, do planting vegetables and flowers, and that can be a good activity to do. So that's really interesting. We are at 3 minutes to the end, so I want to thank everyone for taking their time today to participate. I especially want to thank Dr. Zechner for her work in presenting today. The video of this webinar will be posted online at the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation. And we're talking about sharing slides.
Yes, I'll send those to you after. I can send the slides over. No problem.
Okay. So in the meantime, when you exit the webinar, you'll see a brief survey. Please take a moment to provide us with feedback before moving on with your day. And finally, we're in the process of scheduling another webinar for the fall, so pay attention to your email. And thank you everyone so much. Thank you, Dr. Zechner. This was a really interesting presentation.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here today and all of your comments.
Thank you. Don't forget to fill out the survey.